For over 600 years, one empire controlled the bridge between Europe, Asia, and Africa. It conquered Constantinople, ruled Mecca and Medina, stood at the gates of Vienna, and commanded the loyalty of over 30 million people across 3 continents. Then, after World War I, it was carved up into more than 40 separate countries. But what if it never fell at all? What if the Ottoman Empire was still standing today? The story starts small, almost absurdly small compared to what it became. Around 1299, a Turkish tribal leader named Osman I carved out a tiny principality in northwestern Anatolia, in the crumbling shadow of the declining Byzantine Empire. He wasn't a king or a sultan, just a warrior chieftain with ambition and a loyal following of Ghazi warriors. Frontier fighters driven by conquest and faith, Osman's descendants expanded steadily for over a century, absorbing rival Turkish principalities and pushing deep into Byzantine territory. The turning point came in 1453, when Sultan Mehmed II, just 21 years old, did what no army had managed in over 1,000 years. He conquered Constantinople, ending the Byzantine Empire and giving the Ottomans one of the greatest cities on earth as their new capital. The Ottoman Empire produced some of history's most consequential rulers. Mehmed II the Conqueror gave the empire its capital and its confidence. But the empire's true golden age came under Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566. Under Suleiman, the Ottomans controlled Hungary, most of North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Balkans, a territory so vast it touched 3 continents at once. Suleiman wasn't just a conqueror, he was a legal reformer, known in his own empire as Suleiman the Lawgiver, for overhauling the empire's legal and taxation systems. Under his rule, Ottoman art, architecture, and literature flourished, producing masterpieces like the Süleymaniye Mosque, still standing in Istanbul today. At its peak, the empire stretched from the gates of Vienna in the west to the Persian Gulf in the east, controlling critical trade routes between Europe and Asia, making it one of the wealthiest and most powerful states on the planet for nearly 3 centuries straight. No empire lasts forever, and the Ottomans' decline was slow, nearly 300 years in the making. By the late 1600s, military defeats began chipping away at Ottoman territory. Europe was industrializing and modernizing, its militaries and economies faster than the empire could keep pace with, earning the Ottomans the grim nickname the Sick Man of Europe. By the 19th century, nationalist uprisings across the Balkans in the 1800s and early 1900s stripped away territory piece by piece. Then came the fatal decision, joining World War I on the side of the Central Powers, alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary. The empire fought hard, but ultimately ended up on the losing side. Defeat triggered total collapse. The victorious Allied powers partitioned Ottoman territory, and in 1922, revolutionary leader Mustafa Kemal Atatürk formally abolished the Sultanate. A year later, the modern Republic of Turkey was born from the empire's Anatolian heartland, the final chapter of a 623-year story. So let's rewind. Imagine the empire modernizes fast enough in the 1800s to survive, reforming its military and economy the way Japan did during the same era, and staying neutral in World War I instead of joining the losing side. What would today's map actually look like? First, the modern Middle East looks completely different. Countries like Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Israel exist today largely because European powers drew new borders after the empire's collapse, most infamously through the Sykes-Picot Agreement. If the empire never falls, none of those borders get drawn. The same way, the region likely remains organized as Ottoman provinces instead of separate nation-states. Second, Istanbul, not Dubai or Riyadh, could be the region's economic and cultural capital today, sitting at the literal crossroads of Europe and Asia with centuries of continuous infrastructure and trade dominance, instead of colonial era disruption. Third, religion and governance. An unbroken Ottoman caliphate means the Sultan would still hold religious authority over much of the Sunni Muslim world, potentially preventing the political vacuum that allowed extremist groups to later claim religious authority for themselves in the 20th and 21st centuries. Fourth, oil. The Middle East's massive oil reserves were discovered in the early to mid-20th century, largely under the control of newly formed Western-influenced nation-states. Under a surviving Ottoman Empire, that wealth might have stayed concentrated under a single imperial government, instead of dozens of separate oil-rich states, completely reshaping global energy politics. Globally, a surviving Ottoman Empire reshapes the entire 20th century. No collapsed Ottoman Empire likely means a very different World War I outcome and aftermath. Since the empire's partition was a major part of the post-war settlement, it could also mean no British-French mandates in the Middle East, reshaping the entire foundation of 20th century Western involvement in the region, including the origins of modern U.S. foreign policy there. The Ottoman Empire would likely stand today as one of the world's major power blocs, alongside the U.S., China, Russia, and the EU, controlling critical energy resources, trade routes between 3 continents, and a population in the hundreds of millions. Now let's push the timeline even further. What if it wasn't just survival? What if the Ottoman Empire had actually won World War I against Britain? This isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. The Ottomans actually won several major early battles, most famously the Gallipoli campaign of 1915-16, where Ottoman forces under commanders like Mustafa Kemal inflicted a humiliating defeat on British and Allied forces trying to seize the Strait to Constantinople. Now imagine that momentum carrying through the entire war, instead of collapsing under later pressure. Here's why this matters so much for India specifically. At the time, British India was the crown jewel of the British Empire, its largest colony, its biggest source of soldiers, raw materials, and revenue. Millions of Indian soldiers fought for Britain in WWI, partly on the promise of greater self-rule afterward. If the Ottomans had decisively beaten Britain, the shockwaves into India would have been massive. As the world's largest center of Sunni Islam's symbolic leadership, the Ottoman Sultan also held the title of Caliph, spiritual leader of Sunni Muslims globally. An Ottoman victory would have dramatically emboldened India's own Khilafat Movement, a real historical pan-Islamic movement that mobilized millions of Indian Muslims to defend the Ottoman Caliphate, even in our actual timeline. In this alternate timeline, a triumphant Ottoman Empire could have actively backed and funded uprisings against British rule in India, turning a spiritual movement into a full geopolitical one, combined with a weakened, war-losing Britain unable to hold its overstretched empire together. Indian independence could have arrived decades earlier than 1947, potentially in the 1920s instead. But it's not necessarily a cleaner outcome. A Britain that loses WWI and loses India decades early doesn't gracefully hand over power. Historically, declining empires tend to leave chaotic power vacuums. An earlier, more abrupt British withdrawal, potentially without the decades of political groundwork that shaped 1947's transition, could have meant a messier, more fragmented partition, possibly more princely states refusing to integrate, deeper regional conflict, or competing foreign powers, jockeying for influence over the subcontinent's resources and ports. There's also the trade angle. The Ottomans controlled key overland and maritime routes between Europe and Asia. A victorious, stronger Ottoman Empire sitting astride those routes could have repositioned itself as a dominant middleman in trade between Europe and a newly independent India, potentially making Istanbul, not London, the financial gateway to South Asian trade in the 20th century. So, better world or worse? Let's weigh it honestly. The pros: continuous infrastructure and administration across the Middle East and Balkans, instead of a century of redrawn borders and conflict. The Ottomans historically practiced relative religious tolerance for the era, allowing Christian and Jewish communities to practice under a structured millet system. An unbroken empire could mean more centuries of that coexistence model instead of some of the ethnic conflicts that followed its collapse. The cons: a single ruling dynasty controlling 3 continents for 700 plus years likely means far less political self-determination for the diverse ethnic and religious groups within it. No independent Greece, Serbia, Egypt, or Arab nation-states as we know them today. Centralized imperial power over such a massive, diverse territory also historically bred corruption and stagnation in its later centuries, problems that don't just disappear because the empire survives. There's also a harder truth. An empire that never collapses also never faces the reforms that collapse sometimes forces. Some of the modernization, education access, and political rights that came to the region in the 20th century came specifically because old imperial structures broke down. Maybe the fall of the Ottoman Empire, like the fall of Rome before it, wasn't just a tragedy. It was the painful birth of dozens of new nations, each writing their own story instead of one empire's chapter. But for over 600 years, one empire held together a third of the known world, and in another timeline, it still might.
If the Ottoman Empire never fell, would the modern Middle East be more peaceful? Or would one empire's grip have just delayed the inevitable?
That's next week's What If. Subscribe to IFverse, and I'll see you in the next timeline.